everybody, welcome to our next Q&A session on YouTube. If you attended this session live, then you had the opportunity to ask me questions in real time. But even if you are watching it after the premiere of this video, you can still write any questions in the comment section below, right under this video, and I will be checking it regularly and trying to give my best answer. So I got a lot of requests about publishing some tutorials or at least some videos showing my process, but with a voiceover. And I tried to squeeze in the entire process for this character study illustration that I created for my agency for Advocate Art, as I was taking their character study intensive course. I tried to fit it into one video. If it was all shown in real time, I think it would be more than 6 hours, maybe even 10 hours. So I tried to keep it as compact as possible. And in this session, I wanted to show you how I create a vector-based illustration using a lot of really yummy vector brushes in Affinity Designer. I am drawing on my iPad, but this process can be also recreated on desktop. Let's get started. I always start with a sketch in Procreate. I'm not using Procreate anymore, but I still have some favorite brushes there and I use it for sketching, so it's basically my digital sketchbook. And in order to warm up for this character study, for the course that I was taking from It's Me, I wanted to draw some monkeys from real photos. So I sourced those real photos of monkeys from Google and all over the internet, and I just used it for practice purposes. And I wanted to draw a composition that would include the animals and some botanical elements. Afterwards, it turned out that my monkey characters are a little bit too old and maybe a little bit too realistic, and I have redrawn it completely, and I tried to make them a little bit more fitting for very small children. So the features are a little bit more exaggerated, like the head is bigger, the eyes are bigger, and the facial expressions are quite playful. And then I took the sketch to Affinity Designer and I started to work on my color palette. If I have a color palette that I like to reuse, I save it as vector assets, but I also have it saved up in the swatches panel in Affinity Designer. And then I used the pixel persona to try to block in some colors so that I could see if the colors are working together in a nice way. I started by blocking in the colors for my heroes, so for the monkeys, and then I moved more to the background. But yeah, something that I forgot to mention at the beginning, I always start with the background square. So in my case, I'm usually working in the square format. I first set this kind of beigey, pinky light background, and then I started to color my heroes and my botanical elements. I used a really chunky brush, and I only used those blobs of paint as a placeholder, so to say. As I was choosing my colors, I started with this jungle color palette, but I kept going to the color studio through my swatches and sometimes to the sliders to change the colors a little bit and to come up with a nice color thumbnail for the illustration so that I am ready for coloring in when I'm creating my vector base. Your color palette is not set in stone, so this is only just to see if the main colors are working together. You will see later on that I'm changing my colors quite a lot, but it still gives you a good starting point and you can at least create your base with more confidence, and then you can just tweak it as you proceed. Sometimes I also take an older illustration of mine, I just place it as photo here in Affinity Designer, and then I can use the eyedropper tool to source the colors that I already used in some of my past illustrations, so that some of the colors are reoccurring. They like I keep reusing them, and then my feed or my portfolio looks a little bit more consistent because the colors are at least quite similar. I like juicy colors, I like vibrant colors, and my illustrations are always quite vibrant. So now that I am done with my color thumbnail, I have duplicated also the background square, and I placed everything in one group and I put it somewhere to the side, and this will help me now exactly to create my vector base. So to create my vector base, I do everything with vector tools, so I stick to the designer persona, and then I usually use the pencil tool. Sometimes it's with the sculpt mode, like in this case I am blocking the color for the monkey using sculpt. Sometimes if the shapes are a little bit smaller, I'm using directly the auto close pencil tool function so that the shape closes automatically very fast. And then I also often switch to the node tool and I play around a little bit with the nodes so that I can adjust my shape. What is important is that you close your shape, because this will prevent any mistakes in the future and will look more professional. Your vector shapes have to be closed. Sometimes I block in the colors as just one shape, but if I know that some elements will be more in the foreground and another, for example, part of the monkey's body will be more in the background, like the tail or the head will be in the foreground, then I draw it on separate layers. The hands of this monkey, for example, are in the background, so I'm just drawing it as one chunk. And also the tail of this playful monkey is in the background, so it's on a separate layer. You will see that I'm using quite a lot of sculpt mode. It's very handy, but then when you're using sculpt mode in Affinity Designer, you have to close your shapes manually. So it's a process that you have to get used to, and everyone has their own preferences for working either with or without auto close, using sculpt or not using sculpt. I've seen it all. I also chatted with some fellow illustrators asking them about their favorite techniques, and people kind of mix and match. The reason why my entire base for any illustration that I create is vector, even if I decide to work in the pixel persona or even if I'm adding in the details in vector brushes, is that vectors are insanely easy to manipulate, to recolor, to change the shape, and I tried also to use more the pixel persona, but I just couldn't commit to raster. It's my personal preference that I like working with vectors, and I find them much more flexible. It took me a little bit of time to learn Affinity Designer. It wasn't that easy, and I know that some people who are trying to learn the software, they feel a little bit intimidated, especially coming from Procreate, you know, from pixel art or raster art. But once you see how everything is easier, like your whole process is more efficient, it's very hard to go back to raster programs. You can also see here in Affinity that you can go to stock photos. They are royalty-free, free to use photos for references. You can even take the colors from your reference photos from the interface directly, so this is very handy. I just wanted to double check on the monkey if it's better that it has darker hands or lighter hands, and I wanted to look at real photos of monkeys for that. Try not to be influenced by other artists drawing monkeys. So if you're looking for the so-called inspiration, I think a lot of people go to Pinterest, and this is when they find illustrations by other artists, and this is a little bit dangerous because you might actually copy someone else's art. People say these days they are inspired by someone, but I think the line is very thin. You really have to be careful. So the best way to proceed, in my opinion, for example, in this case for picture book illustration for children, is to take real photos, for example, the photos of real monkeys, and try to draw them in your style or make them look a little bit more childish or sweet or cute or kawaii. You will also have a glance at my layers. Every monkey is in a dedicated group, so I do not bother that much with naming my groups unless this is like a professional file that I have to send over to the client. But if it's for my portfolio or a personal project, I just make sure that everything is grouped nicely. So each monkey, for example, as you could see, has a separate dedicated group. And I like to keep everything tidy, sorted by an element or by colors from the very beginning. And here I switched to the vector brush tool. I recently wrote a nice blog post about the advantages of using vector brushes in Affinity Designer. You can really get used to it. So you go to the vector brush tool, which you can see here on the left side, and then you go to the brush studio on the right side, and you select a brush that you would like to test. And then one thing that you have to remember is that color changes on the spot are not possible when you're in the vector brush tool. In order to manipulate it further, to change the width or to change the color, you have to exit the vector brush tool and you have to go to the move tool. But also if you want to select your starting color, you select the vector brush tool, you go to the colors panel, and you select the color for your brush on the stroke side. So not the fill, but the stroke. And you will see me here, this illustration was very spontaneous. Like I didn't pre-practice it for the sake of this recording. I was really drawing on the spot. And that's why, like I said, this video could have been like easily more than 10 hours because it's a lot of, like I wanted to put for this one in particular a lot of detail, but I don't know all the brushes by heart. I can give you some recommendations. You will see in the folders some of the brushes, some of the folders that I'm opening in the brush studio. You will figure, okay, those are Vera's favorite brushes. Some of them I do remember, but some of them I don't. I really don't. And then you gotta go to the vector brush tool. You have to do a few swatches for the test and kind of remind yourself, aha, this is the brush I used to use, for example. It will be good for this or that. Or you test out completely new brushes and you can save them into a dedicated folder. So this is what I do. When I open the brush studio, you will see that I have two folders kind of labeled with favorite or favorite textures. You can copy a brush that you tend to use over and over again, and you can create a copy and put it into a dedicated folder because you tested it and you know, aha, next time it will be handy and I don't have to look for it in all those, I don't know how many folders there are, like 10 folders or something like that. It will be very useful to have it at hand right away. For this illustration, some of the shapes I'm also using the rectangle tool. I'm teaching, by the way, about all those tools in my newest Affinity Designer course, where we are illustrating together a mock-up for a cover design for small children. It's just a suggestion of a project, but the goal is actually to learn Affinity Designer tools by doing like a fun project. You don't have to be a children's picture book illustrator. You can be any artist specializing in patterns, editorial, whatever. The purpose of this course is to get familiar with the tools, and then you can do the project with me, the cover design with the board book mockup, but you don't have to. You can just take what you learned in this course and you can use it for your own art or for your own portfolio needs. A lot of the vector brushes here are brushes that I haven't used before, and that's actually the beauty of it, that Affinity Designer has a lot of brushes that come already for free. I think I only bought brush packs by Frankentoon. Those are, like, this is the main provider of new brushes for me. I really love their brush packs. But aside from that, especially if you're starting off, I really don't think that you have to buy anything. Affinity has a lot of free brushes to choose from, and before you test them out and figure out which ones are working well for you, it's going to really take some time. Oftentimes I'm also clipping my shapes into another shape. In Affinity you can use clipping masks. So all you gotta do is just to drag a shape and put it inside of another shape, and it will create a mask. When I'm creating the smile of this monkey, I am using, I think for the first time, the pen tool. I don't use it that much. I prefer to use the pencil tool or the vector brush tool, because they give this, I mean, it's still vectors, and vectors tend to be a little bit rigid and a little bit flat. So I prefer the other tools, pencil and vector brush, because they, for my style at least, they enable me to create something that it looks a little bit more hand-drawn and not so rigid and flat. So I use the pen tool only, very infrequently, but there are some artists who use it all the time, especially when they're tracing their sketch. So the monkeys are in one folder, and now I will be tracing the base of my illustration. This will be in a separate folder. So the monkeys will be in a separate group, and the elements of the environment will be in a separate group. And I've been already talking for a while, but you see we are still involved in creating the base for our illustration. It's a little bit time consuming, but I think every illustration is, and a lot of people, they are not aware that it simply just takes some time. And of course, the more you illustrate, the more familiar you become with the tools, and then maybe you can speed up some things. You will see in this speedpaint that I'm also recycling some vector assets here directly in Affinity. But aside from that, it still does take some time, especially if it's a more detailed illustration with textures. Every now and then I refer to my color thumbnail, and I use from the Color Studio the eyedropper tool to select the color from the thumbnail. Sometimes I have a few for one element. It really doesn't matter. It's only just to block in the color, and once the shape is blocked, I will be able to carry out further changes. So again, the colors are not set in stone. I can change their hue, saturation, brightness, or I can change the tone of the color right away. I can switch green to blue, for example. It's very easy with vectors. Make sure that you are grouping everything in a neat way, because this will pay off. And then you will be good to go when everything is in the right order. So if I already know that I want to block in a color in a particular color, I make like a test blob. So you see that I select the pencil tool and then I draw something, and depending what I've drawn before, sometimes there's just fill, sometimes there's also like this massive stroke, which I first have to switch off. So I do like a test blob, and then I see, okay, is it just fill? What color do I want? I set the color, I delete my test blob, and then when I'm looking the color for the shape that I want, it already has the settings that are important to me. As I was creating those exotic leaves, I also used, you will see that I'm using some Boolean operations. So if you want to merge some shapes together, you have to go to the Move tool, and then you have to use the Add Boolean operation. And then if you want to subtract, so you want to erase some shapes with other shapes, you have to go again to the Move tool, Boolean operations, and then use subtract. In case you're using the pencil tool and the shape is a little bit wonky, pay attention to the stabilization, because sometimes when the auto close is on and you have, for example, the rope stabilizer on, then it will kind of cut some of the shape. Then you might want to switch off the stabilization. I forgot to mention at the beginning that the sketch that you see here, the sketch of the monkeys, it is on the topmost layer. The opacity is reduced to roughly half of the opacity, and it is set to multiply, and it is on top of everything else. And once I am done with my vector base, I will be able to switch this sketch off. If I'm going a little bit out of the lines as I am painting in my vector base, it doesn't matter, you don't have to be too rigid about it. And remember to group everything, so for example this little butterfly, the body of the butterfly, the wings and the dots, they will be in one group for sure. You can also do color changes on the group level. So I can, for example, those pieces of wood and tree, I can group it into one group, and then I can set the color on the entire group level and adjust or tweak the saturation and brightness on the group level. For this little butterfly, who looks surprised, if I were using shapes from the rectangle tool, that might look, for me personally, a little bit too polished. But it is a matter of your personal style. Sometimes it is easier to start with the rectangle tool and to start with the obvious shapes, with the squares, with the circles, or with the semicircles. And sometimes it's good to do it the other way around and to keep using the pencil tool so that you get more of this hand-drawn feeling, even though you're drawing everything in vectors. Using the pencil tool over shapes, over the rectangle tool, gives you lines that are a little bit more wonky and they feel a little bit more organic. As I was drawing this monkey with the oranges, the monkey was hungry. I really needed to pay attention to the order for the oranges, like which one is in the front, which one is in the back. And you will see me in a minute as I will be adjusting my colors that I like to switch to the grayscale so that I can see the contrast of the colors better. So here some of the oranges, they need to be lighter or darker, because otherwise everything is like a soup of colors that don't have enough contrast. And I do it at the beginning a little bit, and I pay attention to it more as I go. Okay, the base is kind of ready. Some small details are still missing, like some stems for the plants. But before I work on the foreground, I like to add some details on the background. So the background, when I say background, it's this square layer that is right at the back. And the details will also dictate how much of a contrast should all the other elements have. So just to sum it up for you again, you start with the background square. So in this case, it's a square. Then you draw the entire base, like all the base colors for your shapes and for your character. And then you go back to the background, add in the textures, because yeah, it will be important for the overall contrast of your illustrations as you're tweaking the colors for the rest of the elements, like the botanicals and the monkeys and the trees. The texture that I am frantically playing around with for this illustration is from the pencils folder. It's for free, it's there, anyone can use it. It's not a set that I bought or anything like that. And it looks very realistic, and I absolutely love using it. The blog post that I've written, I summarized some of the advantages of using vector brushes, because some people cannot kind of understand how those brushes are working. So some people think that those brushes are not real vector brushes, they don't have the quality, so to say. I'm not even sure how to explain it, but in the article that I have written, I was explaining that actually they're absolutely amazing because they are a raster texture on a vector path. What does it mean? Vectors actually cannot have texture because vectors are mattes, vectors are smooth lines with nodes. It's a path, right? It's mathematics. And raster have like pixels, pixel elements, also with varied opacity. And there's also this varied opacity that gives sometimes this watercolory texture, for example. This is something that you cannot combine in a single vector, so to say. It's hard for me to explain it. So in a way, you cannot have a texture per se in vectors. But vector brushes in Affinity, they try to bridge this difference, and they put this raster texture on a vector path. And now this is where some people are like, oh, but this is still raster. Yes, it's a raster texture on a vector path, but it's on a vector path. And what does it mean? It means that they are still as scalable as vectors. So compared to the pixel persona, I would be able to recolor it at such an ease. I can do whatever I want with them with regard to the color. I can also go back to the brush studio and I can change the brush type. I can go to the stroke studio on the right, right under the color studio, and I can adjust the stroke width to again manipulate the shape of this texture. And for this illustration, by the way, I am using a canvas 4000 pixel square. This is what I usually use for my illustrations and also for my patterns. And as if I wanted to export it at, I don't know, 10 times the size. So instead of 4000 pixel square, I would like to have 40,000 pixel square, which is absolutely huge. If I've done that, I am actually daring you to test it out. Do that, like export it. You can change your pixels when you go to export in Affinity, change 4000 to 40,000 or 100,000, save it to your camera roll if you have enough storage, and you will see everything is crisp. There is no quality loss. And if you were doing that in Photoshop or in Procreate and you resize it from 4000 pixels to those 40,000 pixels, it will get pixelated. And with vector brushes in Affinity, it will not get pixelated because it works together with the vector path. Like, I don't even know exactly how it works, but it's like magic. I am able to, as a compromise, to put this texture on a path, which is a typical thing for vectors, and I will be able to export it at any size as I want. And I think this is the biggest concern for people who are wondering, should I be using vectors or should I be using raster? The biggest concern that I hear is that people are afraid that they will create something in one size on one canvas and they will not be able to adjust the size according to what a possible client needs, for instance. Well, this is fixed. With vector brushes, you will not have this issue because you can rescale it up and down without any quality loss, and that's the biggest advantage. There's like a whole selection of vector brushes, like there's dots and pencils and watercolors. There's oil and acrylic paint. You just have to go through them and you have to test them out. And if you're feeling adventurous and you're feeling you're not having enough, you can always buy something from, for example, True Grit Supply or from Frankentoon. I'm not sponsored by them, by the way. I was just looking randomly on the internet for some new Affinity brushes, and I came across those two websites. And yeah, I have some sets by Frankentoon, but to be honest, you don't really need it, especially at the beginning. I'm just encouraging you to see what Affinity already has. Here on the monkey's face, by the way, I am using a vector brush, but on the stroke, it's a brush from Frankentoon. So you can not only fill out your vector base with a vector brush texture, you can also take your shape, for example here the face element of the monkey, and you can change the outline, so the stroke of your shape. And it took me some time to find like a nice shape that looks like a little bit of hair or fur on the monkey. How I selected this brush, how do I know, this brush will look good on this fur, for example. You really have to test it, like, okay, you can have a look and pause this video to see what brushes I am using. Feel free to also test them out to copy my process. But in the end, and this is where the fun also begins, you have to test it out for yourself. For example, here you see that I'm trying to figure out, okay, how to add more texture, more scalable texture, that's the keyword, more scalable texture to the body of the monkey. And I didn't even know that this brush will be good. I needed to test it out. I start with some color. You can, by the way, you can also start with black. So you go to the vector brush tool, you go to the color studio, you select the black for your stroke, and you first draw with black on your vector base, just to see the shape, you know, just to see the silhouette of the shape. And then you exit the vector brush tool, you go to the move tool, and you do further tweaks. So you change the color, the brightness, saturation, and so on. The fur elements on the body of this monkey, I can draw them first, and then instead of the move tool, you can go to the node tool, and then to the stroke studio. From the node tool, you can still manipulate the nodes and move it around to your liking. And from the stroke tool, I am usually playing around with the width, because that will also kind of change the way the brush flows, and you can get some unexpected results. So it's a little bit of trial and error, but this is something that you have to go through yourself. Yeah, fortunately this video is sped up, so like I said, we could be sitting here all day. You can observe here on the head of this monkey that I'm really trying to find something nice. I really don't know what I'm doing entirely. I know I would like to have some more detail and of course obviously some texture, but some of the brushes, I don't know how they work, so it's my job to figure it out. And once I find some brushes that are clearly my favorites and I keep coming back to them, you can, at least on the iPad, swipe to the left and the menu will open, and then you can copy it to a dedicated folder in your brush studio. You just have to remember to first create a new group for your favorite brushes. Okay, now I'm moving to the elements of the background and I am testing. So I was testing really different brushes and different textures on the wood. There's also a very handy brush from the Pixel Persona that imitates the feeling of the wood. It's also from a set by Frankentoon. But again, I try not to use the Pixel Persona too much. I only use it for sketching. And as much as I can, pretty much 100% or 99.9%, I try to only use the designer persona and vector paths. Once your lines are in, like the lines for the structure of the wood, you can go to the move tool, so you have to exit the vector brush and then you can go to the brush studio And you can flip through different brushes, zoom in, zoom out, and see the effects this brush does. That's why it takes so long, because I don't know, and I also want to find new nice effects. And again, to do that, I have to do a lot of testing. Those brushes are cool, by the way. They are from the markers folder, and they work very well with my style. Once your shape is there, you can also copy it, make some copies so that it's a little bit faster. And remember, from the Move tool, you can resize the shape, and from the Node tool, you can work on the nodes and you can move them around to change the shape. Okay, here I'm testing out again pencil strokes instead of the markers layers. I don't know why, I just thought it would be nice that especially the background and the botanical elements have more of this traditional media feeling. So I knew that I had this vision basically in my mind that the textures that I will be looking for should go towards pastels or pencil or colored pencils. And again, those textures are on a vector path, so I will be able to scale them, resize them, recolor them as I like. But when I show, for example, this illustration to people, they're like, what? This is vectors? And I say, yes, this is vectors, because even though I am using a raster texture on a path, it pretty much behaves like a vector. It has, yeah, the same properties. Adding in some shadow, I'm also using blending modes in Affinity. You can change the blending mode on the layer level or on the group level. For the shadows, of course, I like to use multiply. If you want to speed up, you can copy from the 3 dots menu the shape, and then you can select another shape, and again from the 3 dots menu you can paste in style. And in the case of those shadows, I was just drawing a flat shape without any blending mode or without any changed opacity, and the style was completely copied in. Ooh, I really like the texture on those leaves, the leaves of the trees. They added this very nice dimension to the elements. You can first draw your texture outside of your shape, and then you can clip it. And those vines, for example, the ones in the background, they were like separate shapes, but I merged them together with the Boolean operation add. Now on the stone also I am clipping one shape, and then I'm just spontaneously moving through the stone, trying to add this pencil-like texture as well. And you can also directly go to the color studio, and I usually play around with the brightness at least. And I try to include textures that are both a little bit darker and a little bit lighter so that it looks more three-dimensional. I often again switch to the grayscale mode in the navigator, and I double check the overall contrast of my illustration, and if something needs to be darker or lighter, I go to the color studio and I tweak it further. You can also see that I'm zooming a lot in and out. It's because often when you're showing your work on your portfolio, on your website, or on the agency website, they're not as big as you create them. Usually potential clients, they do see them as thumbnails. So I like to really zoom in and zoom out to see if it's readable and if it doesn't merge into like one soup of an illustration. I want it still to be very readable, even if it's just a thumbnail. By the way, let me know in the comments below if you would be interested in like a beginner's course for maybe some simpler botanical project, learning how to use specifically vector brushes, because I'm thinking about creating such a course. On this butterfly, for example, I am grouping all the elements by color, and then from the Move tool, I am adjusting the colors on the entire group level instead of going one by one and selecting each element individually. I try to stay within my color palette, and if I'm missing some color, I just go to another element somewhere in the other corner of the illustration, and then I source it. And then I apply it to the shape on the other side of the illustration, for example, the wings of this butterfly. And then I just change the hue, saturation, brightness of this shape. And in this way, if I'm sourcing the colors from throughout my illustration, the whole piece looks more consistent because it still kind of stays within the same color palette. Yeah, I also forgot to add some shadows to those oranges. I think it will look nice. This was a bit of a challenge because I selected the color for the monkey to be this orangey brown, and then the monkey is holding the oranges. So as long as you go to check the grayscale of your illustration, I think it can work out. But it wasn't easy, and I didn't want to change the color on the monkey, and I also wanted to keep the oranges orange, so this was a challenge. Now at this point I was getting a little bit tired. It also took me a little bit of time, like I didn't do this illustration on the same day, but I was getting a little bit tired. I wanted to work on something else, so I went to the asset studio. I also have a course about creating vector assets in Affinity Designer, and I was looking for some flowers that I previously created, and I tried to recycle some elements, and I also made copies of them to spread them also a little bit more evenly in this lower left corner. And maybe not for the main characters or the main elements of your illustration, but by all means, if you're reusing some of the elements that you've drawn before, especially botanicals or some small details, I think it can really keep you sane and keep you more productive. So it's not really, in my opinion, cheating because it's something that you have drawn and you didn't copy it or anything. I think it can help to fill up your illustration when you're slowly getting tired or you need some inspiration without necessarily looking at someone else's art. You just look at something that you have drawn yourself before and you recycle it as best as you can. So here I also recycled those little tulips. I think they look like little exotic lotuses in this illustration, and I found them very fitting, so I recycled them. Cool, and we are nearly coming to an end. Basically, the last texture touches on those little leaves that are sprouting out of the wood, out of the tree, and I will be done soon. I think that's really plenty of detail. I'm just doing some final tweaks on some leaves that might need some shadow, but I don't want it to be like a flat color, so I'm using the same pencil-y brush that I used before to create some shadows in a darker tone of green. And then again, zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. I inspect the illustration and I think I am finally happy with it. This is the final result. It really took me some time, but I absolutely enjoyed the process. I think that Affinity is great because you can combine vector with the pixel persona with vector-like textures. So it gives you a lot of freedom, a lot of scalability, and it can really enable your workflow to be super efficient. And it's a software that you should definitely consider. Thank you so much for watching. I will be answering your questions also after this video. Remember to post your questions or remarks or course requests in the comment section below under this video. Let me know how you liked this speed paint video with a voiceover this time. Was it more useful for you? Thank you for watching and make sure to subscribe to my channel not to miss any future tutorials. Bye bye, happy creating!